everyone, this is Kathy, and welcome back to Kathy's Happy Home and another Sunday Praise. I haven't done them in the past few weeks. I was trying to decide exactly what I wanted to say, but I started a new study in the book of Esther with my Bible study, and one of my viewers suggested that I just use that as my Sunday Praise because she'd be interested in hearing it. And so I am going to redo my Tuesday Bible study for you. And we'll start off today in the book of Esther in the Old Testament and chapter 1. Um, we'll start with telling you a little background. Esther's the last of the historical books in the Bible, and its main character is, of course, Esther. Um, Esther is her Persian name. It was equivalent to Venus. It was the morning star. That's what it meant. And she is a star in Israel's history, shining brightly in a very dark time. So let's start with verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel. So this King Ahasuerus is well known in history. You might know him by his other name, Xerxes. He inherited the Persian Empire from his father, Darius the First. And Darius is mentioned in Ezra, Daniel, and Haggai in the Old Testament. So we know this man actually existed. His history is well known in archaeology, and historians and archaeologists have actually discovered the ruins of his palace where these events happened. And this is approximately 483 BC when these things take place. And he was planning for an invasion of Greece. Unfortunately, according to history, this was a total failure on his part. So it's going to happen several years after the events that we're talking about today. But at this time in history, Athens is at its pinnacle. And in Greece, they were celebrating the 79th Olympic Games, if you can imagine that, 79th Olympic Games. The Persian Empire that Ahasuerus was king of was the largest the world had ever seen. It covered what today we call Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel, and also parts of modern-day Egypt, Sudan, Libya, and Arabia. So it's a huge amount of land. Also, at this time, Ezra had already returned to Jerusalem after having been conquered by the Babylonians, and the temple had been rebuilt 30 years before this time, but more simply, without the glory that Solomon's temple had. And in 40 years from this time period, the successor rather of Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes the First, would send Nehemiah back to repair the walls around the city of Jerusalem. Okay, let's go on to verses 3 through 9. That in the third year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. These were white I'm sorry, there were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So the first feast was for all the government officials, where Ahasuerus showed off the glory and splendor and riches of his kingdom. And this feast lasted for 180 days. Can you imagine having to have a feast for all these noble people for 6 months? 6 months. And the second feast was for the citizens of the capital city of Shushan, and that lasted for 7 days. Now, this, you could be rich, you could be poor. It was open to anyone who wanted to come to the feast at the palace. And what was the reason for these feasts? The basic reason was his pride. The king wanted to impress his subjects with his display of wealth and power and majesty and generosity. So there's little doubt that Ahasuerus paid for this feast, not out of his own pocket, but from tax money, public treasury. So when we give a description of that palace, doesn't it sound beautiful? I said, I as a woman would love to see this, because I can just imagine these beautiful blue and white curtains and the silver poles that they're hung on and the gold and silver couches. It must have been absolutely magnificent. A mosaic floor with black and white marble and turquoise thrown in there. It must have been the most beautiful thing you can imagine. And among some of the ancients, each guest was obliged to have a drink with the current round or else leave the party. But the second feast that the king gave, he said, do what you want. You don't want to drink? Don't drink. You want to have a lot? Have a lot. It was entirely up to each person what they did. And then, while he's having this second feast, Queen Vashti has a third feast for the women in the royal palace. Queen Vashti was the wife of King Ahasuerus. So now let's look at verses 10 and 11. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was murry with wine, he commanded Menuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and officials, for she was beautiful to behold. When it says that the king's heart was merry in wine, that's another way of saying the king was drunk, right? And according to Jewish tradition, this request came from an argument among the men at the feast as to which country had the most beautiful women. So Ahasuerus decides to sell the issue by putting his wife, the queen, on public display. And it's not specifically said, but the implication is that Queen Vashti was to display herself in an immodest way. Some scholars I read had said that she was to come in naked with just her crown. Some said no, she was to wear see-through clothing. In any case, it was not something that a queen should be doing, or any woman for that matter. In verse 12 it says, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Now, there's no indication that Vashti was a follower of the one true God. but she had enough wisdom and modesty to know that this was something she shouldn't be doing. Now, the Bible says that wives have a special responsibility to submit to their husbands. In Ephesians 5:2, we read, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." But this doesn't mean that a wife must obey her husband if he tells her to do something wrong or if he commands her to sin. Every command to submit on a human level is conditioned by our higher command to obey God. But it's important for a Christian in such a situation to maintain submissive and respectful attitude toward the one in authority, because it's possible to disobey the command of another, but to do so in the right manner. But it doesn't say whether Queen Vashti had this attitude or whether she was like, "No, I'm not doing this." We don't know. But Jewish traditions say that her refusal had nothing to do with modesty, but that she was ready to do this, except that God gave her leprosy. This is an obviously fanciful tradition. There's nothing in the Bible that says that's what happened. But of course, the king was furious. So we know Queen Vashti was in a very dangerous situation. She didn't put herself in this situation because she wasn't even at the banquet. But I'm sorry, I lost my place here. But she has decided that she is going to use decorum. So verses 13 to 22 say, "Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Mecumen, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence, and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs?" And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, "Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come.' This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small." And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Mecumen. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. So the king listens to his advisor, and he showed himself to be unreasonable and wrong. He should have been honored by the dignity of Queen Vashti. Yet history's profile of Ahasuerus shows him to be an unreasonable and foolish man in many cases. On one occasion, Ahasuerus executed the builders of a bridge because an ocean storm destroyed it. And then he commanded that the water and the waves be whipped and chained. to punish the sea. How stupid is that? The purpose for the harsh treatment of Vashti was so that she would not set a bad example for the other women in Persia. Ahasuerus wanted to reinforce the idea of man's leadership in the home. And they were afraid, because of Queen Vashti's example, that wives would despise their husbands. And therefore, these nobles wanted to ensure that each man was going to be master of his own house. Now, the goal presented here was admirable, and there is a need for every man to sense respect and honor from his wife. But this was not the way to go about it. The way they're doing things to gain and preserve this respect were foolish. You can't demand respect from someone. If it isn't freely given, then it's not worth anything. And that's the end of chapter 1. That's where we leave it. But what does this book have to do with us today? It compares this man, King Ahasuerus, king of Persia, with our king, God, the king of heaven. So in Persia we see a drunken king making demands of questionable morality. But in heaven is a wise king who never orders his people to do anything immoral. In Persia, there was a king who used others for his own entertainment. But we have a king in heaven who seeks our good at all times. In Persia, there was a king who knew nothing of humility, even though his power was limited. But in heaven, we have a king who through Jesus embraced humility, although he is infinitely powerful. And in Persia, there was a king who was so self-inflated that he spent 6 months celebrating his own greatness, and for 33 years to elevate others. That's our lesson for today, and I'll be back next week with chapter 2.